Climate change is real, but it is natural, cyclic, and correlates with earthquakes. Natural dual forcing climate model. The March 10, 2013 version of this climate model was built on top of a climate change graph displayed on the homepage of the Climatic Research Unit, CRU. The CRU crafted this graph to promote human-caused global warming by highlighting the temperature's increase since the 80s in red. But there is more than meets the eye when we look at this graph carefully. In fact, it proves the opposite, which is that climate change is natural and has a 60-year cycle. This length points to a cosmological cause. Simply put, what climate scientists considered as global warming is actually a summation of the lack of global cooling during the cooling phases, 1880 to 1910 and 1940 to 1970. By using a curve-fitting buildup, the natural dual forcing climate model explains climate change since 1880 and makes a prediction with an unusual conclusion. Scientists didn't understand climate change because it is complex. So we take a step-by-step approach. We notice on curve 1 the three extrema, A, B, and C, which are 30 years apart. We remember that curve 1 is an averaged variation of yearly temperature statistics. Errors interpreting this curve are always possible. Segment AB is clearly a cooling period, while segment BC, highlighted in orange, is a quite linear warming. We hypothesize that we might find an equivalent pattern within the next two 30-year periods, CD and DE, a cooling such as segment AB, and a warming similar to segment BC. We measure BC and DE and find out that both have the same temperature increase of 0.47 degrees Celsius. Then we copy the curve BC in yellow and superpose it over DE. They also have a similar shape. We find two identical warming phases that started 60 years apart. This is not a coincidence. So global warming could not be caused by us humans. With two equal warming phases and two cooling phases with equal length, we hypothesize that we are before a cyclic variation which was supposed to have equal warming and cooling phases. But an unknown process perturbed it during each cooling phase. To find out, we flip segment BC to both sides, curve 2. Did this mislead climatologists? What misled climatologists? To find out what misled climatologists, we compare the temperature variation of AB versus BC. While the amplitude of the warming phase BC is 0.47 degrees Celsius, the cooling phase AB is just 0.27 degrees Celsius, 58% of BC. Obviously, something went wrong during the phase AB. We need to find out what it is. We note that curve 2 matches curve 1 during the 10 years before, 1900 to 1910, and 10 after, 1940 to 1950, segment BC. But the peak A in curve 1 is lower than in curve 2, see the green arrow, though we are still missing something. Cycle 1 has its peak at A, and we suppose that it belongs to another cycle. To explain why, we copy curve 2 to curve 3 in green and superpose the two peaks in A. This time, curve 3 reproduces curve 1, real, during the first 10 years of the period AB. We just found the first main forcing cycle since 1850. We observe that since 1880, the global temperature, curve 1, entering a cooling phase on the green curve that lasted 10 years, until 1890. After that, the temperature rose for another 10 years. Since 1900, the globe continued its cooling, but this time on the orange curve. The explanation is that a 0.47 degrees Celsius cooling phase started in 1880. But after 10 years, a warming burst, W1, of a second forcing, interfered with this process. When the warming burst was done, the 0.47 degrees Celsius cooling phase continued with the same slope as at the beginning, but on the orange cycle. This caused a 0.20 degrees Celsius lack of cooling for the next phase. The same forcing repeated during the second cooling phase, but this time, the warming burst W2 was stronger and lasted almost until the end of the cooling phase. As a result, the warming phase DE was shifted up by 0.38 degrees Celsius, almost double of the first cooling phase. The total lack of cooling in 1970 was 0.58 degrees Celsius, enough to instill panic in scientists. Summary of the climate model and the combined impact of the two warming bursts in the global warming in 2000. 60-year cycles of natural main forcing. Equal 30-year phases of warming and cooling. Occasional warming bursts from secondary forcing. Bursts start 10 years after cooling phases begin. Climate model key points. The main forcing has a 60-year cycle with 30-year cooling and warming phases of 0.47 degrees Celsius. The two previous warming phases have the same temperature rise of 0.47 degrees Celsius. The cooling phases, C1 1880 to 1910 and C2 1940 to 1970, were 0.27 degrees Celsius and 0.09 degrees Celsius respectively, due to two warming bursts that started 10 years after each phase began. Global warming, which was interpreted by climatologists to be caused by human activities, is in fact generated by a lack of global cooling during these cycles. As a result, the last warming phase started in 1970 at a temperature that was 0.58 degrees Celsius higher than what was expected without these bursts. In 2000 to 2030, we are in a cooling phase. We can predict the warming phases, but for the cooling phases, we should be able to assess the secondary forcing and the strength of its warming burst first. Since it is not the case, for now we can just estimate we might have one of these four possibilities that are all within its 0.6 degrees Celsius range. Our forecast does not match with official temperature statistics because they are fake. If they reflected reality, we were supposed to see the 10-year cooling after 2000. As we already know, Phil Jones acknowledged this cooling, and also his fear of the scientific community if he said that the world had cooled from 1998. Okay, it has, but it is. With the 0.2 degrees Celsius lack of balance every 60 years between the cooling and warming phases, our Earth would get 200 degrees Celsius, approximately 400 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter within around 60,000 years. If this was true, everything alive would have been roasted a long time ago. We found out that the Earth has a thermostat, a main forcing, with 30-year warming and cooling phases, but that a secondary forcing interferes with a cyclic balance. This idea is supported by an article from where the attached graph is taken, which states that approximately every 100,000 years or so, our climate warms up temporarily. According to the graph, it seems that the temperature surge is occurring right now, which even in the worst case would not exceed 6 degrees Celsius. However, we cannot predict when the secondary forcing stops interfering with the main forcing, and the global thermostat starts working correctly again. Climate change correlates with earthquakes. The point we want to prove in this presentation is that climate change is 100% natural and doesn't have anything to do with human activities. All climate models provided by climatologists have been proven wrong because Earth is a dynamic geosystem that is warming, shaking, leaking, swirling, and sliding all at once. Natural phenomena are interrelated, but they do not directly influence each other. They are all generated by the same primary phenomenon. If this sounds a bit mysterious, it's because it is. Parts of these natural phenomena are studied by the environmental earth science. This is good, but it's just the first step, because other sciences such as seismology and volcanology have not been included yet. But they should, if we want to understand our globe's activity. Indeed, Preliminary research points to the hypothesis that climate change correlated with earthquakes over the last 46 years. Yet a longer period might disprove it. Who knows? The next slide is just a tentative way to start explaining this correlation. Correlation between climate change and earthquakes. Legend. Number 1. Second forcing. Remnants of the previous warming burst. Number 2. Main forcing. Steady warming phase. Number 3. Less earthquakes before the strong part of warming phase. Number 4. Main forcing. The strongest part of the warming phase. Number 5. Main forcing. Big earthquake drop from 1995 until 1998, when started the warming pause. Number 6. Main forcing. Cooling phase mixed with precursors of the next warming burst. Number 7. Second forcing. Beginning of the next warming burst. Thank you.